So help me God. So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to So Help Me Pod, a podcast that explores the presidential theologies and public policies of the United States presidency. My name is Rob. I am a doctoral candidate at the Pacific School of Religion. My counterpart here is Scott. He's my younger brother. He's pretty cool. We like him a lot. So today on the show, we're going to be talking about our nation's 34th president, President Dwight D. Eisenhower. He lived from 1890 to 1969 and served from 1953 to 1961. President Eisenhower was a Presbyterian. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was catapulted to fame from his service in our nation's military as a 5-star general and the supreme commander of the Allied expeditionary forces in Europe. He supervised the most consequential campaign of the Second World War, the Allied invasion of Normandy, on June 6, 1944, also known as D-Day to many of us. This giant of a man was equally private, including his reticence to include his faith as a campaign prop. Despite this, though, he stood and volunteered to serve in multiple capacities and in the leadership of our country. So let's get to know Dwight David Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was born in 1890 in Denison, Texas. He would be raised in Kansas and have affinity for places like Gettysburg, not only for its military significance in the American Civil War, but for its geographical location, as he was of Pennsylvania Dutch ancestry, and he would be the last president to have been born in the 1800s. The next president after him, John F. Kennedy, would be far, far younger. The future president would rise to national prominence through his military and combat service during the Second World War. That said, he was also a well-distinguished West Point graduate and served in the military stateside during World War I. During the height of World War II, he would serve as general of the United States Army and supreme commander of the Allied forces. He would successfully coordinate Operation Overlord, also known as the ground invasion of Normandy on D-Day. He would successfully liberate Europe and personally witness the horrors of the Holocaust. After recognizing the possibility that many might downplay such a horror, he ordered the careful and meticulous documentation of concentration camps that we now have today. After the war, he served as president of Columbia University in New York City. He wrote a successful memoir and was also the first supreme commander of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, during the post-war pre-presidency period. Eisenhower would capture the Republican nomination in the election of 1952 with his simple campaign slogan, "I like Ike." He would do this in order to he was kind of a newcomer to he hadn't had political service, and that simple phrasing, that simple "I like Ike," had a way of identifying with the everyman that he was after for their vote. He would select future president and California Senator Richard M. Nixon as his running mate. Many felt this selection served as a counterbalance to Eisenhower in good ways. Nixon was a young and career politician, and he would offer a different perspective to the president's older and newcomer status. He would be matched against Adlai Stevenson and win in a landslide, becoming the first Republican in the White House in over 20 years. Again, it's important to note here that when we're talking about Republicans and Democrats, even the politics were more center than they are today. So that's good to remember when discussing any presidency, especially in the mid-20th century. During his presidency, President Eisenhower would become the first president to view the modern press conference as a bully pulpit for his presidency. During his 2 terms, he would hold over 200 press conferences. He would champion the interstate highway system, something that we still enjoy to this day. Every time you get on the interstate, in large part, that is thanks to the work and credit of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. It was an attempt to boost the economy as rumblings of the Cold War burst onto the scene. The United States had first tested the hydrogen bomb in 1952. The Soviet Union's successful test of the hydrogen bomb in 1955 signaled a ramping up of tensions between the former allies. In some ways, having a career military man in the presidency was actually really beneficial because Eisenhower was strong, but sought a plan that would lead to disarmament and away from nuclear proliferation. He knew the dangers such weapons could hold for both sides and sought to express that at multiple junctures. President Eisenhower's administration declared racial discrimination a national security issue, a Republican doing that, no less, in its fight against the Soviets. He successfully assisted in desegregating schools after Brown versus Board of Education, the landmark Supreme Court decision that desegregated schools. He mobilized the 101st Airborne and federalized the Arkansas National Guard to escort the Little Rock Nine so that they might gain entry into Little Rock Central High School after their governor and elected officials had made it almost impossible for them to do so. Despite his rather supportive stance on integration, he still had some issues that must be attended to in our careful analysis of him as a president. His policies regarding LGBTQ plus individuals contributed to McCarthy's Lavender Scare, which led to the purging of gay and lesbian federal employees because of their sexual orientation or due to suspicions surrounding their sexual orientation. President Eisenhower's 2 terms would end with him leaving office due to being the first president being term limited by the 22nd Amendment. He would become the first sitting president to become eligible for the Former Presidents Act. The former presidents Truman and Hoover enjoyed such privileges as they were still living. President Eisenhower would leave office to immediately enjoy the recently passed law that included all kinds of things, including a pension. President Eisenhower would outlive his successor, John F. Kennedy, by over half a decade. He would die in 1969 at the age of 78. His vice president, Richard Nixon, would be the president during that year and would eulogize him in this way. Some men are considered great because they lead great armies or they lead powerful nations. For 8 years now, Dwight Eisenhower has neither commanded an army nor led a nation. And yet he remained through his final days the world's most admired and respected man, truly the first citizen of the world. So what about his faith in public life? What about that made him who he was? Though considered a convert to his faith later in life, Dwight Eisenhower was exposed to faith traditions at an early age. His mom was a devout Jehovah's Witness. The future president was named after famed evangelist Dwight L. Moody. And his decision to join the military was actually met with disdain by his family and his mother, whose faith tradition, they were ardently pacifists. They did not believe that you should go to war. So why would their son be going to war was their question. He would be sworn in as president in 1953 by placing his hand on the Bible owned by the first president of the United States, George Washington, which was opened to 2 Chronicles 7:14, and his personal West Point Bible opened to Psalm 33:12. He would then be the first to open his first inaugural address with a prayer. Despite his own personal piety, he had not been baptized before assuming office. He would be baptized 10 days after taking office as president of the United States by the Reverend Edward Elson at National Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. This makes him the only president of the United States to have been baptized while in office. And he was careful to practice his faith in public, though, and wanted it clear that his personal faith that he was articulating was not that of the nation's. Even still, he would become admired for his faith perspective. President Eisenhower would go on to continue to attend church in his post-presidency in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He would die, and a state funeral was to be held at Washington National Cathedral on March 31st, 1969. President Lyndon Johnson and President and Mrs. Richard Nixon, French President Charles de Gaulle, and over 2,000 invited guests joined him in remembrance of the late president. So that's his faith in public life. Scott, what questions do you have?
What does the Presbyterian denomination look like in the 1960s, 1950s at this point in American history?
So I think many people today wish our churches looked like that of the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Episcopalians did in the 1950s and 60s. This was the heyday of church. Everybody went to the church. It was kind of weird if you didn't go to church. So you could see this as a very the reason Eisenhower believed that he wanted to be baptized was in large part due to his own personal piety. But you could see why he didn't want to have that as a campaign tool, because everybody went to church. He didn't want it to see as something that he was trying to coddle into being part of a conversation that he had not been a part of previously.
It's interesting that he was baptized. Is that something that, like, does he do anything else? It's also interesting that he had two verses instead of just like swearing on a Bible. Anything in his personal life, or like, did he feel less than? Why two? Is it normal to?
Well, that's becoming more and more normal to see presidents choose more of a historical Bible, like what he did with President Washington's Bible, and then have one of his own that was like a West Point Bible. I know the Obama did that in his terms. Biden and Trump, they all chose different multiple forms of scripture by which they chose to be sworn in. As for his, he was baptized. He was the only president to be baptized while in office. But that said, he also was very private about it. There's this great book, The Soul of the American President. It's talking about Dwight Eisenhower's faith. And, there was one time that a clergy person tipped off the press that the president would be attending church that Sunday. And Dwight Eisenhower was very kind of cordial about it, but said that should never happen again. Like, I don't want this to be a circus, not only for himself, but for those around him trying to attend church. He just wanted to attend church as a human being. And yet, of course, we know with presidents, there has to be Secret Service protection. There's press. There's, so there's ways in which he could have gotten around it, and he was trying to do that. And yet there was a clergyman that thought it appropriate to let the press know that the president was coming to his church. So, yeah.
Which church did he attend regularly? If everyone
he normally attended the church in DC. While in DC, he normally attended the church that he was baptized in, which was National Presbyterian Church there in the district. One of the things I really respect about President Eisenhower was assurance that his faith need not define his presidency, and his presidency need not define his faith. He was a private man concerned with his country and desperately wanted to see this nation a more perfect union. He had seen such horrors by which many of us would never witness in our own lives. Yet his conviction in the goodness of the American promise and in God was both idealistic and full of possibility. So what's up next? Next up, we'll discuss one of the two living presidents on our list, and the only president on the list that I've actually gotten to meet personally. President Jimmy Carter is one of the most faithful men to have ever held the office of the presidency. His convictions that he held both in office and currently holds in his post-presidency are defining characteristics of the best of this nation and what it has to offer. Join us next time on So Help Me Pod as we discuss President Jimmy Carter. You've been listening to So Help Me Pod, a podcast of Beloved Journal in conjunction with Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. The podcast is offered in partial completion of the Doctor of Ministry degree for the Reverend Robert W. Lee. All opinions and insights offered are solely owned by that of those who offered them and do not reflect the views of stakeholders in the project. There have been 45 men and 46 presidential administrations, all of them unique. Some of them have been more interesting than others, some of them more terrifying than others. All have been part of the grand expression of democracy on the North American continent and part of the wider conversation of self-governance in the world. These men have failed profoundly, and we have failed profoundly in following their leadership along with our own sometimes antiquated and backwards ways of viewing and acting in the world. That said, this form of leadership is unlike few other, and the greatest gift we have has been given in the ways in which the American experiment continues to prosper despite our terrible misgivings. We are better off because of these men, and we are forever in their debt.
For more information, visit www.roblee4.com/presidents.